our first Letters and Art Society reading series event of the season. I'm Callum Cunningham, and on behalf of the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe, thank you very much for being here. We'll begin with an important acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape people of Southwestern Ontario as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways where Fanshawe College is located. Further, we acknowledge the cultural diversity of all Indigenous peoples and pay respect to elders past, present, and future. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of original inhabitants of Canada and acknowledge the important contributions Indigenous people have and continue to make in Canadian society. The college respects and acknowledges our Indigenous students, staff, elders, and Indigenous visitors who come from many nations. We're excited and honored today to have Duncan McCue as our guest. I think he'd be too modest to agree with me, but I'd like to suggest that his is one of the most important voices in Canada for a few reasons. In a country as geographically large, culturally rich, socially stratified, and inevitably complicated as ours, our ability to speak and listen to each other, to share our opinions, present our arguments, to tell each other our stories, these things are absolutely vital in our journey together to imagine what this place we call Canada is and can be. Now, all these things I just mentioned sound pretty abstract, don't they? Hearing each other's voices in a national conversation. The fact is, though, that Duncan McCue plays a vital role in that conversation, and I mean that literally. Since the summer of 2016, he has hosted Cross Country Checkup on CBC Radio 1, Canada's only live nationwide call-in show, and since it's been on the air weekly for over half a century, truly an iconic part of our national culture. It's a real opportunity to tune in and listen to Canada talk for a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon. Or if you choose, to call in yourself. And at the center of that conversation, the voice connecting us is our guest today. Duncan also uses his voice in his role as a journalist, where he's been recognized with several distinguished awards and fellowships for his leadership and investigative reporting. He shares his knowledge through his role as a professor of journalism at UBC and at Ryerson. And he's a regular contributor to CBC's flagship news show, The National. He's here today with us, though, in his role as an author. In his book, The Shoe Boy, a Trapline Memoir, which has been called a new classic of First Nations literature, he has ventured to give voice to his experiences as a teenager, where he spent 5 months in northern Quebec. But wait, I'll stop there. No one is here to listen to me give voice to his story, so we're here to listen to what he has to share with us about the writing of his memoir and to hear some of the stories and the lessons contained within it. So please join me in welcoming our guest today, Duncan McCue.
Thank you. What a nice introduction that was. Anin, Ankudans Indigenicas, Main Gun Dodem, Chippewas, Georgina Island, Dunjaba, Minwa, Jean Ashmo and Duncan McCue, Newswin, Anishinaabe and Dow Toronto and Dunda. And I too want to echo and acknowledge and thank the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, whose traditional territories we're on here. And it's so nice to come into a building, a school in particular, and to hear that acknowledgement. That is just one small step that we all in this country need to take on a daily basis and recognize the long history of Canada, a history longer than 150 years for sure. I am really pleased to be back here. I think the last time I was in the London area, I was up at the Chippewas of Thames. I was doing a story on lacrosse and some women lacrosse players, and I didn't get to spend enough time in London, but I was in that wonderful community and watching the women play an amazing game of lacrosse. So it's good to be back here in London. And I'm really touched, actually, to be talking about the book that I wrote, the little book that I wrote. And so I want to just basically, Callum was very kind and didn't give you a summary about what it's about, so I'm going to tell you what it's about. And I'll share with you how it got written, why I wrote it and what I hoped people would get out of it. But before I do that, I just want to ask everybody just to take a minute and close your eyes for just a second. And if you get nothing, a day from now or a week from now or a month from now, if you don't remember that guy at McCue that came here, I do hope you remember this. I want you to think, while your eyes are closed, think about a person who has been an influential teacher in your life. Close your eyes and just think about that person for a second. And it's amazing when you think about how many teachers we have in elementary and secondary, and then hopefully here in post-secondary. It's amazing how many teachers we have over the course of our educational careers or over our lives. But think about how many were really, really influential and made a change for you. So do you have that picture? Good. That's how this book started for me. was what you guys just did. I was in a creative writing class. I was on a fellowship at Stanford University in California, of all places, and I was in a creative writing class, and we got an exercise where the teacher asked us to write about a teacher who had influenced us in our lives. 2 pages. So I went home and I had to think about it, and I think most of us think about our, when you asked about a teacher, most of us think about our elementary school, Mrs. Brown, who was, really nice and held my hand at recess, or Mr. Jones, who taught me the deeper significance of Plato, or whatever it may be. We think about teachers in a classroom context. But then when I closed my eyes and thought about who was an influential teacher in my life, the name that came to my mind was Robbie Matthew Sr. And that's what this book ended up being about. I wrote 2 pages for that creative writing class, which ended up being page 3 of the book, actually. That little short essay about why Robbie Matthew Sr. was so influential to me. When I looked at it and I went, wow, there's an awful lot there in that little 2 pages. And all the other students in my creative writing class, they said the same thing. They were like, what's going on in that little section that you wrote about your teacher? And so I ended up writing more and more and more about it during that creative writing class, trying to unpack why this old man, this old Cree man, who I'm not even sure how old he was when I was with him. I think he was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. Why he had become such an influential teacher in my life. And so I want to tell you about that. That's what I'm going to, and I'll read a couple sections of the book and maybe help you understand that. I want to talk about why Robbie had such an influence on me. But there are 2 other things I want to talk about, and it's so lovely that Callum began this with a land acknowledgement, because that's the second thing I want to talk to you about. I want to talk about connection to land, connection to territory, and what that means. And then the other thing that I'll talk about is identity. And so this book was written when I was in my early 40s, about when I was 17 years old. And it is a coming of age story of sorts. I didn't mean it that way. It was just a memoir, but I realized by the time I got to the end that I had changed. And so it is very much about my identity when I was 17 years old. And so I want to talk a little bit about that as well. But let me just set the scene for you, for those who may not have read the blurb on coming to the class today. So I am from Southern Ontario. I'm Anishinaabe, and I'm from a small community called the Chippewas and Georgina Island First Nation. There are about 300 people that live there, just north of Toronto, and about 350 at Christmas time. And I grew up in Peterborough, so just east of Toronto. And my father is Anishinaabe, and my mother is white. She's German and Scottish heritage. Her ancestors moved to Ontario in the 1850s. So way back in the day, they used to call folks like me half-breeds. Not the term that's politically correct any longer, but I certainly grew up identifying as Anishinaabe. My father was and grandparents are proud Anishinaabe. They wanted to pass on their native heritage to me, and my mother, I think, also felt that it was important that I knew who I was as a native person, as an Indian. And so she did her best as well to teach me about native culture and make sure that I was exposed. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, we moved. We moved from Peterborough. This kind of Peterborough is some people call Peterborough Canada's most average town. They do like surveys there and stuff like that when they're trying to figure in polls and things when they're trying to figure out what the rest of Canada may react, because it can be a little bit white bread, Peterborough, although that's slowly been changing, I'm told. But we moved from this southern Ontario kind of suburban town to James Bay. If you're not familiar with where James Bay is, go across to the Quebec. So James Bay straddles the Ontario and the Quebec border. But we were on the Quebec side. If you go over to Montreal and then basically drive for 30 hours straight north, you'll find yourself in Chesapeake, which is the community that we ended up in, which was a Cree community on the shores of James Bay, which at that time had about 2,000 residents. And for me, as a teenager, so I was about 11 or 12 years old when we moved up there, I went through this crazy culture shock. Because I went from being the only native kid in my grade school, and I remember kids on the playground, kind of hopping around, going, "Ooh," it was a curiosity more than anything else, my native heritage to them. But I was the only native kid in my school. And then moved to James Bay, Chesapeake, which is an Indian reserve, and a Cree reserve. The Cree are kind of like Italians and French to Ojibwe and Ojibwe and Cree. We're very close. We share similar kind of language, share neighboring territories, sometimes pissed each other off, sometimes intermarried, so a bit like the Italians and the French, if you want to make that connection. But a very different people. The Cree are very different people than the Ojibwe. Moved up there, and all of a sudden I've gone from being the only native kid in my school to a place where they called me Wamstaguscio. Wamstaguscio in Cree means white man. That's what the kids called me when I showed up there. Because I didn't speak Cree. Cree was the first language. This is a community that had very recently created, actually. The James Bay Cree were hunters and trappers, and because of the isolation of the north, they lived a traditional hunting and trapping lifestyle, certainly into the 60s and even into the 70s. By the time we got there in the 80s, more and more people were starting to settle in the community. But hunting and trapping was still very much a part of their daily lives. So Cree was the first language, and everybody hunted and trapped. And I was a little bit of a fish out of water, to be quite honest with you. I had never shot a gun in my life. I grew up in southern Ontario. I went fishing with my dad. My dad and I went fishing quite a bit. We enjoyed going out in a canoe and going fishing. but I've never shot a gun, never gone hunting, never gone trapping, snaring, what's that? Bow and arrow, no, that's, Indians in Peter Pan, no, that's not something that I grew up around at all, in Peterborough. And to the Cree, hunting is one of the very, very first things that certainly boys learn to do. Boys, when they're very, very small, when they're 4 or 5 years old, are given slingshots. They go around and shoot the dogs and shoot birds and shoot all kinds of other things, which to the southern eye might seem cruel. To a northern eye, it's essential training. If you are going to become a provider for your family, you need to begin your skills as a hunter early and young. And interestingly, more and more young girls are starting to hunt as well now, and that's a nice change to see. But the other real challenge for me, just as a pimply, 11, I don't know if I had pimples when I was 11, but I was getting there. I was starting. But I was in a high school where all of my peers spoke English as a second language. The Cree was their first language. And school didn't really matter to them. The Cree had a not very good experience with residential schools. The Cree had been kind of got the sense from the missionaries who ran the residential schools that building over there isn't really going to help your hunting and trapping skills all that much. And so they didn't have a really strong connection with what was going on in a classroom like this. And so attendance at the school was horrible, to say the least. When I got to high school in James Bay, I was bumped I went up in grade 7 and I was immediately bumped into grade 10. That's how kind of dramatic and different the educational expectations were in James Bay. So it was a shock and moving for any teenager is tough, but it was particularly tough for me going through this culture shock. The one wonderful thing was that there was one family in particular that adopted me. George and Nellie Pachanos became good friends of my parents, and they said, "This boy, he's never fired a gun. You need to take him out into the bush and teach him the important things about life." And so that was kind of my introduction to Cree life when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And let me read a little chapter to you about my first moose hunt. So the geese fly, as they're flying north for the summer, James Bay is one of the major migratory routes for them, and the Cree have been hunting geese since time out of mind. So I'll share with you a little section from my book about my first moose hunt. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah. After we arrived in Chisasibi, my father and I were promptly invited on hunting trips, where I was introduced to my first shotgun. My dad presented it to me, a 16 gauge from his own youth. To load a shell, I had to break open the barrel, then break it open again to discharge the empty casing. This antique astonished the Cree men. They all sported the latest in hunting technology. Shiny semi-automatic Winchester and Remington 12 gauges that held several shells at once and fired as rapidly as they could squeeze the trigger. They made a big deal of passing around my 16 gauge, which apparently reminded them fondly of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. When it came time to practice, everyone reminded me to lean into it. I squinted down the barrel at the soda pop and beer can targets, steadied my breathing, and gently pulled the trigger. The sudden explosion in my ears caught me completely off guard. The shock was nothing compared to the wallop of pain as the gun recoiled into my unsuspecting shoulder. Shooting isn't as easy as cowboys and Indians make it look in the movies. Shooting a moving object, one that is flesh and blood and doing its damnedest to get away from you, proved to be even more difficult. Naturally, my first hunt with the Cree was for geese. Millions of geese and ducks use the coastline of James Bay to rest and feed during their annual migration, and the Cree had long planned their own movements around goose hunting grounds. To this day, Goose Break is penciled into every Cree calendar, those periods of time when geese flock north in the spring and south in the fall, and everyone heads to family hunting camps, leaving the village virtually deserted. The camp was a few hours' drive from Chisasidy. We spent the better part of 2 weeks in the bush. 3 families sleeping in 2 white, big canvas maki. I was surprised to discover goose hunting is a stationary affair. On my first day, after spending hours sitting in a blind made of willow and tamarack, looking out at a muddy, shallow pond, half covered in ice and decorated with wooden and plastic decoys, a dozen geese suddenly appeared on the horizon. The men began calling to them. When it became clear the flock was attracted to our pond, the hunters went quiet, shushing me. We all crouched, still, no one moving. I held my breath, my head tucked into the spruce boughs on the ground. I kept one eye looking up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the geese now circling above us. All I could see were clouds silently floating past in the gray-blue sky. But I heard the geese. The wind whistled through their flight feathers as they glided over the top of the blinds, ready to touch down on water. And then, the jolting blam of one shotgun. The men around me sprang to life. Blam, 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 blam. I leapt up like a jack-in-the-box to see geese wheeling dramatically in the air, honking, pumping their powerful wings to escape. Blam, blam, blam. I pointed my gun at the nearest goose, only to watch the bird crumple in midair and plummet to the earth, shot by another hunter. Blam, blam, blam. I attempted to refocus on another goose. The same thing happened. Blam, blam. As fast as they had arrived, what remained of the flock retreated. The men happily waded into the pond to gather their kill. I hadn't even fired one shot. This scene repeated itself daily for over a week, until after much trial and error, I finally managed to kill the goose. I figured it took pity on me because it landed on the pond so close to me I could have whacked it with a stick. It was my only kill that year, but it was a significant achievement, not only to me, but also to the family who hosted us. A boy's first goose is a milestone in Cree life. A feast was held in my honor. My goose was cooked over the fire, and everyone in camp ate a piece. I was now a provider. While I harbored serious doubts about my abilities as a hunter, the feast made me connected to something older and larger than myself. Still, my parents worried about my schooling. After spending only a year in the north, they asked me if I was interested in attending a prestigious boys' boarding school in the south. It was a difficult decision for them. The annual tuition cost as much as a new car, and I'd be living over 1,500 kilometers away from home. But they concluded my hunting grounds should be territory more familiar to me, textbooks and classrooms. James Bay became a place I visited on Christmas, March break, and summer holidays. 4 years later, high school graduation imminent, I was mulling over the merits of various universities when my dad asked me if I'd like to take a year off school to go out on a trapline. I could smell the wood smoke and taste the dark wild meat, and I said yes. And that's how I ended up going out with Robbie Matthews Sr. So Robbie Matthews Sr. is what they call an uchima in the Cree language. He is a tallyman is what they say in English. And it means that he's responsible for a hunting territory. And so there's kind of an image, there's an image that the settlers had for biased reasons when they arrived in this land, that Indians were kind of floating around nomadically, chasing animals and things like that, and for that matter, the early settlers were convinced that this place was terra nullius, that there was no one here at all. Terra nullius is the Latin term for empty land. That, of course, it wasn't. And it also, the hunting culture of most indigenous peoples in Turtle Island, North America, was anything but random. And the Cree are a really good example of that. They had very, very well-defined hunting territories long before the Hudson Bay Company showed up on the shores of James Bay and said, "Oh, we like those beavers. Can we put them on our hats?" They had set aside land and territorial boundaries for families to be able to support themselves. And the system, what the English common law refers to as the land tenure system, the system that the Cree had set up revolved around the uchima, and the tallyman, the man who made the decision about who was to hunt on the land, how many animals should be taken, where families should travel on the land. And the Cree had that system in place long before the settlers arrived on the shore of James Bay. So Robbie was working a territory, a patch of land, I won't call it a patch, it was gigantic territory, that had been passed on to him from his father and his grandfather before that and his great-grandfather, and et cetera, et cetera. This was land that was part of his DNA, if you would say that. It took about an hour and a half by float plane from the community where we lived to get there, and we were there for 5 months with in a one-room cabin that Robbie had built with his sons, that was heated by a wood stove. Our only source of light was kerosene lamps. And we brought in supplies, we brought in frozen pizzas for the first week or so, and eggs, oh my God, eggs. And then a bunch of cans, Chef Boyardee and stuff like that. But all of that pretty much ran out after about the first 2 or 3 weeks. So we were living literally off of the food that we hunted from the land, the fish that we caught in the lake. Both the big game, the caribou, and very, very occasionally moose that we hunted, but also, more importantly than the big game, was small game. So ptarmigan, those little white fluffy birds, and grouse, the little brown ones go in the woods, and rabbits. Those three things in particular, small game was very much a staple for the same reasons that they feed everything on the food chain. Those small animals were feeding us on a regular basis, as well as fish. But our livelihoods depended on what we went out and hunted and killed. And as you may have gathered from that little section that I read, I was kind of a lousy hunter. I just didn't have the training or the eye for it. And so that was certainly one of the things that I was out there to do, was to learn how to become a better hunter. But what I really began to understand and witness was this deep, deep connection to the land, and how the land had shaped Cree culture. So when you see and I know that you see it here in Fanshawe, when you have an elder that comes into the classroom when you're talking about Native literature or Native politics or whatever it may be, there's a reason why Indigenous communities right across Turtle Island have great respect for elders. And I could see that in practice on the land, because the lessons of a hunting territory are not written down in maps and guidebooks. They're written down in the minds of people like Robbie Matthews Sr., who passes those lessons on about where is a good place to set a beaver trap, about why not to set a lynx trap this particular season, even though lynx is probably one of the most valuable furs that a trapper could trap in that territory. That the population of lynx, he could tell, was low. It was in a low ebb in its cycle. And so he said, no, we're not going to trap lynx this year. We're going to let them rest, let them repopulate. Those kinds of, that kind of wisdom and decision making about weather, that has been part of Indigenous communities and the part of the way that we live forever. And which is why we have such respect and even reverence in some regards for elders. Because they are, they're our Google. Prior to Google, we had elders. And they had the answers to everything. They were the ones that passed on the knowledge to the next generation. And that's why elders are so important. But I could see that when I was up there with Robbie and the way that he knew the land like the back of his hand. And he was passing on those lessons to his sons and then me, the lousy hunter. Things like that became more evident to me as I began to spend time out on the trapline. Sharing. When you go to a powwow, when you go to a Native community, you may find that you are asked to eat and break bread, and there's a strong tradition in Native communities of sharing with outsiders. And I began to see some of the reasons that was so much part of our culture as well. And I'll read one more small little bit for you. I'm half awake and splitting wood the morning the bear arrives. Adrian comes running up the hill at quite a clip. He's waving his hands, motioning for me to stop chopping. He points for me to go to the cabin. Inside, he grabs his rifle. Randy is hopping around on one foot, trying to yank his boot on. Robbie is barking at Bruce, who's scrabbling around under the bed, and Sally is craning her neck to look out the window. "Bear," whispers Adrian excitedly. "Get your gun." I get my .22. For the small game we normally hunt, we all carry .22s, but this is a bear. That calls for a much bigger rifle, and Bruce cannot find the bullets for the .30-30. Robbie swears and grabs his .22 Magnum. It's more powerful than a .22, but not meant for hunting big game. We creep through the door, spreading out over the hillside. We're only a stone's throw away from our cabin, but sure enough, after a minute, a big black bear ambles around the corner. It's fat from eating berries all autumn. I can see its breath steaming out of its nose and mouth. I hold my own breath, waiting. I see Bruce on the far point, but no one else. And then suddenly, there's one shot. It's Robbie's gun. For a moment, the bear stops in his tracks, and then the boys start shooting. It sounds like popcorn popping. The bear turns to the hill, takes off as fast as if it's been stung. I can't believe how fast this huge animal gallops up the hill, faster than any dog I've ever seen. All I can see now is the bear's quickly retreating rear. So I fire once, and then the bear is over the crest of the hill and gone. Robbie and the boys walk up from the lake and Adrian is shaking his head. "We missed it," he says. But Robbie walks up the hill toward where the bear escaped. He bends down, waving us over. He points to the ground. It's a drop of blood. Robbie, Adrian, and Randy quickly pack their bags and head out to track it down. If a wounded bear sits overnight, the meat will taste bad, Robbie tells me. Bruce and I stay in the camp playing cribbage. And he tells me what he knows about bears. Bears have very sensitive ears, but they have bad eyesight. They can't see very far. If you stand very, very still, a bear won't see you. But they're hard to hunt, very hard to find, because they know that the hunters are out to get them. Bears are smart, smarter than all the other animals. Old timers say when a hunter talks to the bear, it understands. It's up to the bear to decide if he'll let the hunter kill him. The way Bruce explains it, the bear's unusual appearance by our camp is more gift than surprise. Late that night, Robbie and the boys return. No bear. Robbie hangs up his pack and his rifle from his pocket. He pulls out a bandana and passes it to Sally. She unwraps it and her face breaks out in a big smile. "Bear chin," Bruce tells me. "That's what you bring back to your wife." Robbie tells the story. At first, the bear had been difficult to track. It was bleeding from the gunshots, but running fast. After about a half an hour, it slowed down and the trail became easier to follow, a steady drop, drop, drop of blood. For 5 hours, they followed the trail of blood until they found the bear curled up under a tree, nursing its wounds, and shot it. The bear was too heavy for them to bring back, so they put it in a cache to protect from wolves. "We'll go get it tomorrow." Robbie is unhappy. The shot wasn't clean, but considering the small rifle he was using, I'm amazed he killed the bear at all. Next day, we take the small canoe through a series of lakes to where the bear is cached. It's medium-sized for a black bear. If standing on its hind legs, it would be almost as tall as we are. When we pick it up, I'm amazed at how heavy it is. Each of us holds one leg and we struggle to lift it over the edge of the canoe. It must weigh at least 400 pounds, loaded with winter fat. In fact, it's odd any bear would be out this late in the autumn. It should be hibernating now. Each of us poses for a picture with the dead bear, grinning and holding up its shaggy head covered in black fur. Robbie agrees to be in a group shot with the bear, but he isn't smiling. Instead, he seems quiet and circumspect, and as we canoe back to camp, he's singing to himself again. Gutting and cleaning the bear lasts all day. There are pots full of fat which Sally boils over the fire. "It's a man bear," says Robbie. "Look at his cock." The bear's penis is hard, skinny, and long. The bear carcass, without fur or fat, looks eerily human. Later, after a long day of butchering with the odor of cooking bear fat lingering over the whole camp, Robbie comes to me with a spoonful of oil and a handful of bones. "Mr. Duncan," oh, he's called me Mr. Duncan, "this will keep your hair black, like mine," he says. Indeed, for an old man, Robbie's hair has very little gray. The bear grease is oily and smells incredibly strong. Following Robbie's lead, I run my greasy palms through my hair, making it clumpy and thick. He hands me 3 small piles of bones knotted together with twine and cloth and tells me to hang them in the trees around the camp. He doesn't explain why. This is just what's done. But I get it. Bears are strong medicine. And it's funny, that was Robbie's way with a lot of different things with me. He rarely sat me down and lectured me. He rarely told me, "Don't do it this way, do it this way." He often put me in situations that I had no idea what I was doing. I now, many years later, have tried to pattern some of the ways that he taught in my own journalism classroom. They call it experiential learning. And it is a very, very effective way to learn, rather than sitting and listening to someone talk at the front of the class for a long, long, long period of time in a room that has no windows. If you want to learn about the lessons of the land, this isn't the best place to be doing it. The best place to be doing it is out on the land itself. And if you want to learn how to become a hunter, the best way to do it is to go out and hunt. Certainly with the guidance of an elder like Robbie to give you small tips along the way. I think I've spoken long enough. And so I would be quite happy to answer any questions that you may have about hunting or Indigenous identity, or also if you want to talk about journalism as well. I'm happy to answer questions. Or the writing of the book, for that matter. I'm just as happy to hear your questions, so if you have any, go ahead.
Drew Hayden Taylor wrote an essay in the 1990s called Pretty Like a White Boy.
Yes.
Are you familiar?
Yes.
With this? It's always had a profound effect on me to think about this sort of middle identity. And it makes me, slightly embarrassed to admit that I've never been in that space, and I struggle to work out what it must be for anyone to feel, I don't know what the word is to describe that identity, but you mentioned really early on that this was made abundantly clear to you in moving from Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario. Do you have any kindred spirit to that sentiment, if you've read the essay before, or to anyone in the Indigenous community who values that space between two places?
Yeah, I mean, part of Drew's, and Drew Taylor is a good friend of mine, and part of Drew's challenge that I think he's felt acutely throughout his life is that Drew is quite fair. Adventures of a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe is one of his books, and so he's quite fair and has blue eyes, and right now his hair's blonde. I think he's actually dyed, he's gone. So, and this was one of the things that I struggled with as well as someone of mixed heritage. Was what I realized, certainly moving up to James Bay, was that the images of what an Indian is and how an Indian acts, many of them were, I had internalized many of the popular media messages that were on my hockey jersey. I went to go play for Curve Lake at the little NHL Anishinaabe wearing a Chicago Blackhawks, and we all had those, the Braves jerseys, and so those images of what an Indian looks like they're embedded as much in non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people as well. And so I had my own kind of decolonizing, if you will, of my own identity to do, but it was made acutely complex because I was mixed heritage. I have a white mother, blonde hair and blue eyes, and so trying to figure, and then there was the urban versus kind of res difference in the Indigenous community that I was struggling with. I had grown up in the South. As I said, hunting was not part of my culture. But does that make me less native? So all of these things were going on in my head as a young teenager. And that was a very complicated place to be as a young teenager, when you're already dealing with your hormones and zits and being horny and all those other kinds of things. To wrap in, who am I? And someone says I'm not Indian, but I am. So going up north really helped tie a lot of loose ends together for me. And that being out on the land gave me a strong sense. I was never, ever, ever going to be a mighty hunter. And that choice I made myself about heading for the classrooms instead of living out on the land for the rest of my life. But it did give me a sense of where my ancestors had come from and why so many parts of our culture are deeply rooted and connected to the land. If that answers your question.
It does. I mean, Taylor's central thesis is that he could become unique, right, to himself and to reconcile that, right? And that led him down a path where he could be a different kind of activist, right?
Yes.
Realizing he wasn't in both. I think that it seemed like there's an absolute mirroring of your experience that could have led you down a path of resentment and hate and fear and everything else, but didn't feel that way in the way that you're processing things in the novella, but also your own decisions that you've made to go to law school and everything,
Yes.
and everything that you've done, right?
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, it's remarkable.
That's an astute observation.
Mhm.
Yes?
Why the shoe boy?
So Robbie called me the shoe boy, and I didn't ever figure out where the exact reason for that. But Robbie went to residential school. There was a residential school in the community of Fort George, which was where the Cree lived before Hydro-Quebec flooded their entire community, I think that the shoe boy was kind of a disparaging term for the tasks to go and clean up and put everybody's shoes together and sweep up and do all that kind of stuff. And because I was a lousy hunter, I was at the bottom of the pecking order, and so I hauled water, I cut wood, I washed dishes, I did that kind of stuff. And he kind of would make joke and call me the shoe boy. And so that's where the title comes from.
Call me back.
No, I wouldn't have done that with him. He just meant it in a joking way, and it wasn't meant to.
Little nickname.
Yeah, it was a nickname more than anything else. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Is there a particular game that you enjoyed eating?
Game, all of it. Yeah, no, you can't give me a piece of wild meat that I won't eat. Although I have been in the wood and had raw whale, and that's a different taste. But no, it's all lovely. But goose over the fire, yeah, twirling over the fire and pouring the oil back over again. It's interesting, I think, when you are feeding yourself, you develop a different connection to animals. And I wasn't really consciously aware of it until I was doing a story for the National, actually, on humane treatment of animals, and I went into a chicken barn. And I don't know, has anyone ever been to a chicken barn? Yeah, where they lay eggs. As far as the eye can see, stacked up, stacked high cages that, I'm not kidding, are about twice the size of this book and about this tall. And in those cages, there are 4 chickens per cage. And the floors are tilted so that their eggs roll down and then go onto a conveyor belt. And then at the end of their very unfortunate lives, they're all tossed into a bin of boiling water. If you have ever seen agribusiness and the way that most of us get our food at the Loblaws and the Safeway and all that other thing, then it is a dramatic comparison to compare to people who gather and kill animals for a livelihood. And so I'm often, some people get upset about fur trapping, and in particular leg hold snares. But when you see how much of the animal is used, everything, and also the respect, and so the bare bones are a good example. What Robbie was asking me to do was pay respect to that animal, because in the cosmology of the Cree, if you do not pay your respect, if you don't give back, reciprocity is the big word. if you don't give back, then the animals won't come to you. And so we took the beaver bones and put them back in the lake. We would often hang these bundles all over the place. And so when I talk about bears being strong medicine, the relationship that the Crees had to the animals that they hunted and killed, sometimes in not so nice ways, as you saw with the bear, it ran on for 5 hours and it undoubtedly suffered. But the connection to that animals is a very, very close bond.
You kind of alluded to why you wrote the book in the beginning, but also, like, you know, you're here talking about your connection to land and how that had a profound impact on you.
Yes.
So how in the writing process did that, like, because, you know, it's hard, I don't know, even like up there when people are speaking the language, I find like that has an impact on the way you think and the way you think about your experiences. So how did that affect the way you wrote the book, like knowing that you're writing not just to an Indigenous audience, but to a non-Indigenous audience, and you wanted to still communicate those connections and those ideas of that feeling of land?
Yeah, I get asked this about my journalism. Am I writing for an Indigenous audience or a non-Indigenous audience? And I don't think it's both. Like and in that sense, it goes to some of that duality again that I've chosen for myself. I recognize that there's going to be both audiences, and so on the one hand, I need to understand that there's going to be people that, you know, the concept of shooting an animal is going to be completely foreign. On the other hand, I need to understand that this is a book for my own people, and that there are lessons there that I hope that Robbie gave to me that I'm passing on through this book in some way. And so there is that duality of readership. The writing of it was a search and rescue mission. I went back, I tried to find my journal at that time. I couldn't. I found it and I wrote nothing for 5 months. And I was already a writer at that point. I wrote nothing for 5 months. I was like, what the? I was doing research for this thing. I was like, what was I doing? And then I kind of dawned on me, I had a girlfriend. I had a girlfriend in the South. And there's a little bit of X-rated material in there that I didn't read, but it's like not really X-rated. But I had a girlfriend and I was lonely for her, and I wrote so many letters to her when I was up there, and she would send me back these letters with like swirling perfume on them. But you know, so I think I wrote everything down to her. So yeah, so I didn't have any written record, and I actually had lost my photos of the time. So it was completely a search and rescue mission to go back from like a 40-year-old thinking back to when he was 17. What is amazing, and for those of you, how many of you are in writing classes here? Yeah, cool. So try this, like just try sitting down and picking an event from your childhood, any random event, and don't think about making beautiful words. Set a timer, say 15 minutes, okay? And say, I'm gonna write about that time that I first skated on a pond when I was 6 years old. And set a timer and write for 15 minutes, as many words as you can. Go as fast as you can about that. And I don't care what the words are. Like just write. And your goal is word count, okay? You wanna like get 15 minutes, you should be able to hit, 3,000 at least, 3,000 words in 15 minutes, okay? Aim for that. But just, whatever, I'm just making that number up. But you know, like just try to write as fast as you can. It's a great writing exercise if you ever get stuck, by the way. It's amazing when you sit down and you get going, like the smell of, the taste of a blueberry got going one day, and I wrote this whole little chunk about going blueberry picking, which I completely forgotten. I'd completely forgotten. But it's amazing the stuff that's embedded in there and particularly these lessons that may have such a strong impact on your life. And so the writing of it was both a joy and a real challenge, because it was just like, oh my God, like, can I pull this stuff out of my memory 25 years later?
I hate to let the clock dictate our time together.